Almost everyone knows that the Haunted Mansion was not one of Disneyland's opening day attractions. In fact, the ride was open more than 10 years after the opening of the park. So it's surprising to know that the Haunted Mansion was one of Walt's first planned rides. Actually, Walt began planning this attraction 20 years before the park's opening. I'm Walt the Quackbox Ghost, and today I'm joined by Will Engel to explore the origins and evolution of our favorite ride.
Fastpass Facts.
As Walt said, the mansion was being planned before the park opened, and to know why, we need to go back to the days where Disneyland was not being planned yet, but an idea for an amusement park called Mickey Mouse Park was being created. Mickey Mouse Park was designed to be a small, family-friendly park located at Disney's Burbank Animation Studios. This park was never built, of course, but many of the ideas and plans for it had a huge influence on the design for Disneyland. One of these ideas was the Haunted Mansion. Back then, the attraction was called Church, Graveyard, and Haunted House, and it was supposed to celebrate the classic haunted house attractions that already existed in amusement parks throughout the world. The idea was that every small town had its city hall, its drugstore, etc., and they also had a house at the end of the street or up a hill that everyone thought was haunted. So they were going to create a small town, with a path at the end of the main street, that would take guests through a church, a graveyard, and finally to an old house on the hill. The original haunted house attraction was envisioned as a walk-through attraction, in which guests would see various haunted scenes throughout the house. But again, this park was never built, and when Disneyland was being planned, the haunted house project was put on hold, even though Walt still had this attraction in mind. Disneyland opened in 1955, and there was no haunted house on site. Walt was postponing it until the park's expansion. And 2 years later, he was ready for this expansion. So he went straight to Ken Anderson's desk, tapped him on the shoulder, and asked him to start working on the ride. As we said earlier, when the Haunted Mansion was first thought of, it was supposed to be at the end of Main Street. This didn't work out in Disneyland, so it was moved to Frontierland. But while Ken Anderson continued working on the ride, Walt thought of a new land for Disneyland, New Orleans Square. He thought that New Orleans Square would be the perfect place for an old southern abandoned mansion at the end of the bayou. So, using a catalog of Victorian decorative art and architecture for inspiration for the outside of the mansion, Ken created the initial designs of what would later become the Haunted Mansion's facade. Ken was also in charge of coming up with the story and the experience inside of the walkthrough attraction, and he was greatly influenced by his experiences at the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. He visited the Winchester Mystery House to take notes of everything. From the size of the tour group to the time it took to complete the tour, he took notes so he could have a better idea on how to keep the crowds flowing inside the mansion. He also believed that a strong story for the mansion was very important because, first of all, storytelling was one of the elements that had made Disneyland's dark rides different from other amusement park dark rides. And not only that, but a story was also necessary so guests could move in order through the ride, rather than stay in one place and clog up the flow of traffic. He came up with 4 different stories for the mansion. The first of these stories was created so that the Haunted Mansion could be somewhat linked to the Pirates of the Caribbean Museum that was also being planned for New Orleans Square. The mansion was supposed to be the seaside manor of an old sea captain. He met and married a young woman named Priscilla, and on their wedding day, he warned her not to enter the attic. The bride decides not to pay attention to this warning and goes right to the attic, where she discovers that he is actually a notorious pirate. Captain Gore finds out, and scared that his wife will tell everybody his secret, he tossed her out the window and killed her. The bride came back as a ghost and haunted the pirate until he took his own life by hanging himself. The second story talked about the Bloodmere Manor, which was the estate of the Blood family. It was built around 1800 in a bayou near New Orleans, and it was then moved to Disneyland to be restored and shown as an example of New Orleans' early architecture. But as soon as it arrived at Disneyland, some strange stuff started to happen. The restoration work of each day was destroyed during the night, and the night watchman reported that he heard creepy screams and saw weird lights. And there had even been a disappearance of one of the carpenters working on the mansion's restoration. Because of this, an investigation was done where it was discovered that the house had a tragic and bloody history of unlucky owners who died sudden and violent deaths. So their unhappy ghosts remained behind to haunt anybody that tried to come near their house. and warned any foolish mortals that dared enter to go home. Then it was decided that the two rides didn't have to be tied together, so Anderson thought of having a ride that featured Ichabod Crane's encounter with the Headless Horseman. This would basically be a retelling of Disney's animated classic, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, with some scenes from Night on Bald Mountain from Fantasia. The last story brought the ghosts from the Lonesome Ghost cartoon. Walt had an idea that there would be a wedding in the house, and the Lonesome Ghost would guide you at certain points. They even talked about having Dracula, Frankenstein, and many other monsters in attendance. And those were the 4-story concepts that Ken Anderson came up with. So Ken Anderson showed Walt his plans for the Haunted Mansion, and he didn't like them. The reason behind this was that Walt wasn't fond of the idea of having old, decaying, and run-down buildings inside his park. So he turned them down by saying that they would take care of the outside of the house, and that the ghosts would take care of the inside. Ken Anderson worked for 2 years on this project, and then in 1958, he stopped so he could go and work on the Sleeping Beauty film. And as soon as he stepped out, Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie stepped in. They began working on the ride's special effects and some of the proposed scenes. Still, at the beginning of 1959, Walt felt that the project wasn't moving in the right direction. He wasn't sold on the idea of doing a walkthrough attraction at all now. And to make matters worse, the Manor's appearance had not been addressed, and he was still not happy with the look of it. So the project was put on hold once more. But the marketing team did not receive the message, and that's why the Haunted Mansion started appearing on official Disneyland maps a decade before the construction of the ride had even begun. In spite of the hold, the Imagineers didn't give up, and by the early 1960s, the issue of the outside design of the mansion was solved. It was decided that one of Ken Anderson's designs would be used, but with a nicer, cleaner look. The mansion's opening was planned for 1963, and so construction on the building started in 1961. Even though Imagineers had no idea what would be inside the mansion yet, they would figure it out before the construction of the building was done. And maybe they would have if Walt's attention hadn't gone elsewhere. Well, it was the 1960s, and the New York World's Fair was about to begin. As we know, Walt was really interested in creating pavilions for the fair, so he put many of his projects on hold so that Imagineers could focus on creating new attractions for the World's Fair. They came up with Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, It's a Small World, Carousel of Progress, and Ford's Magic Skyway, for which they came up with the new Omnimover system that would be really important for the development of the Haunted Mansion later on. With the project put on hold again, the mansion sat empty for the next few years. Of course, with the mansion empty, guests started to ask questions. The only clue as to what guests might find inside was a sign stating that Disneyland's Ghost Relations Department was currently accepting applications from ghosts wishing to enjoy active retirement in a country club atmosphere, described as happy haunting grounds. And that wasn't enough to satisfy guests' curiosity. So naturally, the rumors started. Some people said the ride did open for some time, but that it was so scary that a man actually had a heart attack, so they had to close it down. Another rumor stated that one guest allegedly fell out of the attraction and into a snake pit. So, of course, this also resulted in the closing of the attraction. The last rumor said that the closed attraction was actually Walt's home inside the park. Of course, none of these were true. But guests continued wondering about the empty mansion for the next few years. When Imagineers were finished working on the World's Fair pavilions, they were completely invigorated and excited to continue working on the Haunted Mansion. One of these Imagineers was Rolly Crump. Rolly had been working on the mansion for some time, and he was developing illusions for the animatronics with Yale Gracie. But he was also working in something else. So Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie were again assigned to work in the Haunted Mansion. But Crump wasn't very taken aback by the sketches and approaches that other artists had gone with at the time. So he thought that he needed to take it to the next level. He started working on new sketches that were inspired by 2 films he had watched recently. One of these movies was John Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast film that was made in 1946. Crump was pretty impressed with the human arms in the hallways and the human heads near the fireplace. And he thought it would be cool to add architecture created out of human parts inside the mansion. That's how he came up with the Candle Man, which was a man with his hands up in the air, with his fingers on fire. He also created sketches for a Romany wagon that came to life, man-eating plants, and a seance room. The sketches were turned into little sculptures, and Raleigh was ready to present this to Walt. The other Imagineers weren't sure about adding Raleigh's stuff to the presentation because they considered that it was just too weird. They even told Raleigh that Walt would never go for it, but Raleigh didn't mind. He said he was just having some fun, and it didn't matter if his sketches didn't end up being part of the mansion. So Imagineers continued working to put together this presentation for Walt. The day the presentation came, and they were ready. The room where the presentation was made had a very long table with Claude Coats stuff on the right, Mark Davis's presentation in the front, and the architect's on the left. But where was Raleigh's stuff? Well, they put it all in the corner of the room just behind Walt. 4 hours passed and the presentation was over. And as soon as they finished, Walt asked, "Is that it?" And everyone was like, "Yeah, that's it." So Walt asked, "What's this stuff in the corner?" Everyone was surprised that Walt had noticed Raleigh's sculptures and told Walt that it was just some sketches that Raleigh had been working on. When Walt wanted to know more about it, everyone told him he should ask Raleigh because nobody knew what it was all about. So Walt and Raleigh approached the table, and Raleigh started telling him all about the films and the sketches and how he thought they should have something different inside the mansion. Walt kept thinking about it and asking questions until he finally said, "I don't know, this is really weird." And he just got up and left the room. When Walt left, the rest of the guys in the room told him they knew Walt wouldn't like his concepts because they were too weird. Raleigh just said it was alright because he had lots of fun. The very next morning, Walt was sitting on Raleigh's chair at 7:30 in the morning, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing the day before. When he saw Raleigh, he told him he had not had an ounce of sleep the night before because of all those sketches and concepts he had shown him. When Raleigh started to apologize, Walt stopped him and let him know he had thought of a way of using them all. He told them they were going to have a haunted mansion, but at the exit they would do a museum of the weird, where they would advertise that they had gone around the world and found every little weird thing they could bring to display in that exit area. This would be a place where guests could look at all the illusions Raleigh had come up with, and they could spend hours there. When Walt and Raleigh finished talking about how the Museum of the Weird would work, Walt asked every Imagineer that was working on the ride to come to a new presentation, where he took them through the whole thing of how exactly the Museum of the Weird was just going to be built, where it was going to be used, and how it was going to work. This presentation went on for 45 minutes before Walt announced that he was tired, got up, and left to go home. When the presentation was finished, the rest of the guys changed their tunes and told Raleigh that they had always thought it was a good idea. Work continued on the Museum of the Weird, and it was even shown in Disneyland 10th Anniversary, a 1965 episode of Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, where Walt Disney showed viewers and Disneyland ambassador Julie Rame plans for upcoming attractions. Sadly, the museum did not end up being in the plans of the Haunted Mansion, but Raleigh remembered that while working on this and other illusions for the mansion, he and Yale Gracie were given an entire warehouse to put all their developments and illusions in while they worked on them. So one day, they get a call from personnel. They asked if they could leave the lights on when they left the warehouse because the janitors thought it was pretty spooky to go in there. So naturally, they said yes, and then proceeded to rig the room to prank the janitors so that when they came in, there would be a chain reaction and every ghost and monster that they had there would go off. Of course, the next day, they get a call from personnel, again, letting them know that the janitors were never coming back and that now they would have to clear their own warehouse from now on. And that's the story of the Museum of the Weird. Work continued on the mansion. Sketches were being made, illusions were being created, and stories were being thought up. Everything was going great, and the mansion was coming along nicely until Walts Passing in 1966. Walt had always been a definitive leader with a very clear vision of what he wanted. He guided Imagineers, and he made all the decisions. So, of course, this sad event affected Imagineers in more ways than one. First of all, they had a heavy emotional response to his passing, and the motivation for working was not great around this time. But the other big problem was that Walt had never made up his mind about the premise of the Haunted Mansion. He had given his team the green light to work on whatever they wanted, so that they would have lots of options in the end and pick the best out of all of these. But sadly, this never happened, and Walt wasn't there to decide definitively in which direction to take the project. But Imagineers knew they had to continue working on the mansion, So, they did. The first thing they did was abandon the idea of a walkthrough completely. One of the main problems of the attraction being a walkthrough was traffic flow, and they solved it by perfecting the Omnimover ride system, created by Roger Brogy and Burt Brundage. This system was perfect for the attraction because it would not only keep the traffic flowing, but it would also be able to turn guests' focus on specific scenes, allowing the Imagineers to control what guests saw and heard throughout the show. And having a speaker inside the car was perfect for having a narrator throughout the ride. With this solved, Imagineers started to work on the ride's story. And here's where the real problem started. Without Walt telling Imagineers which way to go, everyone had a different idea, and it basically came down to two different ways of thinking. Mark Davis wanted the ride to be a type of family-friendly ride with many funny gags because he thought that a big, scary ride wouldn't fit in a family-friendly park like Disneyland. He thought of Snow White's Scary Adventures and figured that if this attraction, which only had one scary element, scared children, then what would happen with a ride that had spooky elements throughout the whole ride? On the other hand, Claude Coates thought that the ride should definitely be scary. After all, how could Disney, a company trying to revolutionize the theme park industry, build a silly haunted mansion instead of a thrilling, scary one? This battle went on for a while, with each team of Imagineers designing and creating for their own views of the mansion. But it was time to come to an agreement and finish the mansion. So each of the teams compromised. They decided that there was no point in choosing between funny and scary. They should do both. The ride started by introducing the guests to all the wonders of the Haunted Mansion, which is a way of having the original thought of a walkthrough attraction. Then we have some scary elements like Madame Leota's seance and the Bride in the Attic. And finally, we get to the graveyard where the sillier gags rule the landscape. So with these two problems solved, all that was left was to populate the ride. It was decided that the mansion did not have to have a specific story, but that they would take whatever they liked from Ken Anderson's and other Imagineers' past stories on the mansion. That's how we got the Hanging Man at the beginning of the ride, the Bride in the Attic, the Foolish Mortals, the Ghost Host, and many more things planned for the mansion. Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie were in charge of creating the illusions, characters, and animatronics for the ride. They came up with lots of characters and animatronics. One of these was the Hatbox Ghost. The Hatbox Ghost was designed by Mark Davis and developed by Yale Gracie. He had a skeletal face, a shiny gold tooth, a thickly bunched coat, and carried a cane in one hand and a hat box in the other. He was supposed to be the bride's husband and was positioned just across her in the attic. Guests would come upon the Hatbox Ghost and a flicker of light would create the effect that the ghost's head would disappear from its body and reappear in the Hatbox. It would fit perfectly with the ride's goofy/spooky tone and would have been a dazzling effect if it had worked. We'll talk about this in a little bit. The ride's soft opening was on August 9, 1969. After 18 years of development and 6 years of Disneyland guests wondering about it, there was a press opening at Club 33 in New Orleans Square in the evening of August 11th. And after the press opening, they walked at midnight along the river in front of the mansion and went in and officially opened it. The ride was open to all guests on August 12th. The mansion was obviously a success and has been ever since. The ride had been running perfectly, but less than a month after the opening, the Hatbox Ghost suddenly disappeared without a trace. Why? Well, people said it was because it was so scary that it had to be removed. But actually, it was because the effect never really worked properly. After its removal, the Hatbox Ghost only existed in a series of promotional photos, early renderings, and in the memories of early Haunted Mansion visitors. But it was not seen after that for a very long time. Now, while the mansion was being built, Walt Disney World was already being planned, and a Haunted Mansion ride was on those plans. So duplicates of each mansion prop and scene were constructed, with one staying in California and the others going to Florida to be stored until the Disney World Haunted Mansion was completed. Disney World would not have a New Orleans Square. Instead, the mansion would be located in Liberty Square. So the attraction facade could not be the same Southern mansion as Disneyland's. So it was designed as a mixture of Hudson River Valley, Dutch Gothic style, and a particular mansion in Pennsylvania called the Harry Packer Mansion. It reflects the colonial architecture that was desired for Liberty Square. The ride remained almost the same, but it was decided that this version would be slightly longer and more elaborate than its California counterpart. Then, in 1983, Tokyo Disneyland opened. And sure enough, there was a Haunted Mansion. Only this time, it was located in Fantasyland. This version of the ride is a duplicate of the one we can find in Disney World, but it features some additional scenes at the beginning of the ride. Then, 1992 came, and Euro Disney opened. The park had to have a Haunted Mansion, but it was decided that it would have to be a bit modified for the new park. The attraction was called Phantom Manor, and was built in Frontierland. It was decided that the story had to fit into the western town, so the ride was given a much darker tone as the other Haunted Mansion rides. Many scenes from the regular Haunted Mansions are replicated but altered to incorporate the new western theme and plot. Also, this was the first time that the clean, cared-for structure rule was not followed, because Phantom Manor was made to look untended, overgrown with weeds and scattered with dead vegetation. In 2001, Imagineers decided that it was time the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland got a holiday overlay. They initially thought that having a Christmas Carol-themed overlay would be a good idea for the ride, but decided against it due to the attraction's setting in New Orleans Square. Instead, they decided to base it on The Nightmare Before Christmas, after considering which Disney character would celebrate Christmas in the Haunted Mansion, should Santa Claus ever land there on his journey. Haunted Mansion Holiday opened October 3rd, 2001, and of course, it became an instant classic and a hugely popular ride among guests. During this overlay, the mansion gets completely redecorated, with jack-o'-lanterns and candles. Jack's sleigh can also be found on the roof with his Christmas equation hanging from it. There is also the countdown clock from Nightmare that tells how many days are left until Christmas. As soon as we enter the mansion, the ghost host begins to tell the story of what is happening at the mansion. Large stained glass paintings line the walls of the portrait gallery, depicting innocent Christmas scenes. After the doors shut, all goes dark with the sound of the paintings breaking in half. Soon after, Jack appears for the first time, wishing happy holidays to everyone. During this overlay, we can find Zero floating in the endless corridor, Madame Leota reciting the 13 Days of Christmas in the seance room, Jack's presents and naughty or nice list in the attic, Jack dressed as Santa Claus greeting guests at the gates of the graveyard, Sally daydreaming over a grave, Oogie Boogie at the exit crypt dressed up as Boogie Claus, and many more nods to the original Nightmare Before Christmas movie. And every year, Disney's pastry chefs create a new themed gingerbread house for the attraction. Every year the house is different, and the smell of gingerbread when the Doom Buggies pass right in front of the house is fantastic. Disney also added this overlay to Tokyo Disneyland on September 15th, 2004. The overlay has some changes, but it remains basically the same as the one in Disneyland. In 2006, a major change came to the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland and Disney World. The bride in the attic was given her own story. She changed from being a victim to becoming a Black Widow. Her name is Constance Hatchaway. She was a beautiful woman who wanted to obtain wealth and luxury, so she married several rich men. We can see while going through the attic scattered and stacked wedding gifts along with portraits of Constance and her husbands. In each portrait, the husband's head disappears, showing how she beheaded them so she could claim their inheritance. If you look closely at various wedding pictures, you'll see that the pearls around Constance's neck get more extravagant with each groom. She was never caught and died in the mansion, so she stayed there forever in the attic. Constance is voiced by actress Kat Cressida, who once worked at Disneyland as a tour guide on the Storybook Land Canal boats. Next, in 2011, a new interactive queue was created for the Haunted Mansion at Disney World. We have the Dread Family Mystery Game, which, if you go to our Instagram highlights, you can see how to solve it. An interactive wall plaque with many orchestra instruments that you can touch so they harmonize together. The Sea Captain's Crypt, which leaks water, mist, and bubbles. And a crypt that represents the library scene, which has a side where you push books in and other books are pushed out. And another side, where you see the poetess Prudence Pock is working on her poetry. We get to help her come up with the last word for her poems. One of our favorite parts of this queue is the Madame Leota tombstone, which appears to be made of stone. But suddenly, she opens her eyes, looks around, moves her head a little, and closes them. In 2012, a very creepy and interesting piece of Haunted Mansion history was unveiled. During an episode of Armchair Archivist, fans of the Haunted Mansion finally got to see and learn about the whereabouts of the terrifying Oiwa bust. And if you're wondering what this is all about, well, when Walt Disney was planning the Haunted Mansion, he always told stories about there being many ghosts with no homes, and how he wanted to adopt them, and bring ghosts from all over the world to the Haunted Mansion. Walt shared this story during a trip to London, and the Nippon Television Company heard all about it. So, they decided to send him the bust of a terrifying ghost called Oiwa, a ghost from Japanese folklore, as a publicity stunt. Walt decided not to bring it to the mansion, but gave it a forever home in the Walt Disney Archives, where it resides to this day. In 2013, Mystic Manor opened in Hong Kong Disneyland. This attraction is kind of a counterpart for the Haunted Mansion attractions in other Disney parks, but due to differences in traditional Chinese culture, Mystic Manor has a lighthearted, fantasy-based theme with no references to departed spirits or the afterlife. The ride tells the story of Lord Henry Mystic and his monkey Albert. Having recently acquired an enchanted music box, Albert opens the box and brings everything inside the house to life. And then, after many years, on April 10th, 2015, one of the best things to happen to the Haunted Mansion happened. Disney officially confirmed that the Hatbox Ghost figure would finally return to Disneyland's Haunted Mansion on May 9th, 2015, as part of Disneyland's 60th anniversary celebration. The Hatbox Ghost appeared at the end of the attic scene, and this time, the effect works perfectly. The set dressing around him also includes a cart holding 4 hat boxes, with him holding the 5th, possibly suggesting he was an accomplice of Constance's before she axed him off, or that he was one of her 5 unfortunate husbands. Now, going back to Phantom Manor, in 2019, the ride reopened after a 16-month renovation. There were many changes that came with the ride, from the story to effects to whole scenes. We have a video that talks about all of these changes, so be sure to check it out. As for the most recent changes to come at the Haunted Mansion, in 2022, D23 Disney announced that the Hatbox Ghost would be arriving at the Walt Disney World's Haunted Mansion, and he materialized at the mansion on November 30th, 2023. But the biggest change that has recently come to the mansion is coming to the original mansion. Back in August of 2023, Disney announced that a grounds expansion and retail shop were coming to the mansion in New Orleans Square. The additions will build on the story and the lore of the Haunted Mansion, and include an expanded outdoor queue to immerse guests in enhanced theming, as well as a new retail shop adjacent to the attraction's exit. The expanded queue will tie into the ghost habitant stories and more, including new gardens inspired by Master Gracie, Madame Leota, and the One-Eyed Cat. But thankfully, the pet cemetery and horse-drawn funeral hearse will continue to reside on the attraction's grounds. And Disney meant business with this refurb, because the old queue was completely demolished. There are also several rumors that say that there are even more changes coming to the mansion, but on the inside. Word on the street is that the hitchhiking ghosts at the end are going digital, and that maybe Constance will become an actual animatronic. Who knows? But we can't wait until the mansion reopens to see all of these changes. After all, it's our favorite ride of all time. And if it's yours too, don't forget to tune in this Thursday, May 16th, for our Haunted Mansion Trivia Night, starting at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. See you there.